Welcome to the Military Justice Today podcast with your host, Robert Capovilla and Mickey Williams, covering the full range of military law topics from all branches of the armed forces. Today's episode is made possible in part by the law firm of Capovilla and Williams. And now, let's welcome the hosts of the show, Rob and Mickey.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Military Justice Today, the podcast. This is Matt Starosiak stepping in here momentarily to introduce Robert Capovilla and Mickey Williams. And then on today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dave Schlueter. So Dave, are you with us? Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine.
Perfect. Well, thanks for being on the show today. We've got a lot to cover, some extraordinary topics. First, I'd like to introduce Dave's background a little bit. I'm certain I won't do it justice, but Dave, you've had an extraordinary legal career spanning 40 plus years for sure. You have degrees from 3 excellent schools, your BA from Texas A&M, your JD from Baylor University School of Law, and your LLM from the University of Virginia. You spent 9 years as an Army JAG, many more than that in the reserves. I found it very interesting that you had 2 stints with working with the Supreme Court of the United States, appointed by Chief Justice Berger and then Chief Justice Rehnquist. I'd love to hear some more about that as we get into today's show. You've authored more than a dozen books, many of those kind of the cornerstone and foundation for JAG attorneys on military practice, procedure, evidence, and forms. And you coming up on 40 years in academia, where you've earned too many honors for me to really cover appropriately here. Much of your time, I think, has been at St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio. I know you've been named the Outstanding Law faculty member at least 2 years there, and you're a professor emeritus here as of May of 2022. So, as I had mentioned earlier on, just a real extraordinary legal career. I think all of us that have gone to law school recognize that, you know, to think that they could accomplish all that you have in your time as a lawyer is really something extraordinary. So, I may not have covered everything, but obviously we're thrilled to have you on the show today. We've got some really kind of cutting edge topics that I know Rob and Mickey are interested in talking with you about. So thank you again, sir, for all you've done in the legal community. I thank you, and my family thanks you for your service to our country. And again, we're thrilled to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you for your very kind words. Yeah, it's been almost 50 years. I came on active duty in January of 72, so it's actually over 50 years.
That's right.
So I'm an old guy.
That's right.
Well, Dave, before we get into kind of our funny topic for the day and then our substantive topics, I want to personally thank you, and I know Mickey feels the same way. I got to be honest with you, sir. I learned most of what I know from military justice, reading the Foundations book, reading your book on the rules of evidence. And here's a cool little story. When I had made the decision that I wanted to follow my heart and become a military defense attorney on the outside world, that I didn't want to go be a special victims prosecutor, I didn't think I was ready for the transition. And I was living in a little 1-bedroom cabin at the time outside of Columbus, Georgia. And I would get up every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning and I would read a chapter from your evidence book. And I carry it with me all the time. Same with the Foundations book. And quite frankly, sir, you have kind of indirectly taught me more about military justice than anybody else out there. And I want to thank you for it, because everywhere we go, we see your books and they're just outstanding work products.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great encouragement. The next time I'm working on one of those books late at night, I'll remember your kind words and it'll keep me going.
Absolutely.
A labor of love for sure. Well, our pre-topic discussion today, which is something I created, I hope it goes over well. I've been super excited to kind of put this out there, but our pre-topic discussion today are your top 5 favorite military movies. And so we're all going to give our top 5. This usually digresses into attacks on people's list and sometimes their personalities as well. So there's no telling what direction it might go.
We'll just stay away from college football for this.
Yeah, anytime we talk about college football or movies, it usually takes a turn for the worse. But I'm going to read the list. We'll talk about each one a little bit. We're not going to spend too much time on it, maybe 5-6 minutes. But I'm going to start with Robert Capovilla's list.
Are we reading our own list, Matt?
I'm going to read the list.
I want to read my own list.
And then you might have to defend it.
No. I want to read my own list.
That's fine.
So my number one is Gettysburg, the movie from the 90s with Jeff Bridges. Jeff Daniels. Not Jeff Bridges, yes. Jeff Daniels.
Easy to confuse those two.
Yes. Number 2 is Glory. Number 3 is Lincoln. As the folks can tell, I have certainly I lean towards Civil War movies. I'm a huge fan of. I guess you can call me a buff. Number 4 is not a Civil War movie. Number 4 is Tropic Thunder. And number 5 is what I consider the best movie on World War II with just the absolute best acting, and that's A Thin Red Line.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I think that might be the only one that was on Mickey's list. And so,
oh, you're reading my list.
Tropic Thunder, though, is that a serious movie? I was unfamiliar with that movie. I had to look it up online.
It's the most serious war documentary film ever.
No, it's
really?
It's the exact opposite.
That's what I thought.
Serious. It was meant to mock the other movies, but it is really, really quite funny.
Is that the one where they have the previews before the
yes,
the film?
The Devil's Den and all.
Yeah,
or the Devil's Playground or whatever. Yeah,
you've never seen that, Matt?
I don't believe I have. No,
okay.
I don't think I've seen most of these on Rob's list. To be honest with you, I'm embarrassed to say, but
yeah.
Well, if you ever go back and watch Gettysburg and watching Jeff Daniels's presentation of that famous order given by Chamberlain, draw bayonets or fix bayonets, it still gives you chills. But anyway,
all right. So next we're actually gonna jump to Dave next, and Mickey, I'm gonna put you on the back burner for just a moment here, but. Dave, why don't we hear your top 5 favorite military movies, please?
Why don't you go ahead and read the list, because I've forgotten what I gave you, and we need a drum roll.
That's right. Well, yeah, and we changed it up because I was supposed to give the list, and then the boss changed that. So number 1, you have Top Gun Maverick.
Oh,
so
great film,
brand new movie.
Great film.
Number 2, you have Glory.
Oh,
and that was what Rob had as his number 2. And then number 3 was The Hunt for Red October.
Oh, there you go. That's a great film.
Number 4 is A Few Good Men.
Of course, yeah.
Of course.
No.
And number 5 for Dave is Rambo First Blood, right? The first one.
Yes.
That's a good one. So 2 Tom Cruise movies.
Rambo First Blood was number 6 on my list. That movie, people forget that's a serious movie. That's just not an action movie. That was a movie about the times we were in Vietnam, quite frankly.
So Dave,
and that was like King County, Washington, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that where he was
That's
like
right.
up in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah.
So Dave, there's been a lot of discussion about Top Gun 2 or Top Gun Maverick. So tell us a little bit about why that's your number 1 choice.
It went to the top of the list because we saw it with our family on Father's Day. We all went, even our young granddaughters, and it literally was. It shakes you in your seat because when they put the afterburners on the aircraft carrier, the theater shakes. And so it was a well done movie. Somebody said that the first Top Gun was more of a locker room competition, an athletic event, where they're trying to do the best they can. And this one I thought was a little more serious. There was actually some good flying sequences, and that really I think made it real because they put cameras in the cockpit with the actors who were in the rear seat. So when they're making their tight turns with the G-forces, you actually see Cruise's face and the other actors. It was a well-done movie.
Yeah, they said it was quite challenging on those actors because they did shoot a lot of that, in real-world situations, right? Yes.
And so it's very realistic. And I did some reading about it. It was a challenge because they had to look for just the right lighting conditions, the cloud cover. And they did hours and hours and hours of recording, and then they picked out what looked like the best. So, yeah, I was really impressed. I didn't really expect a whole lot from the movie. I'd heard about it. In fact, our son got our tickets. He and his wife had seen it the previous week and were so excited about it, they wanted to see it again. So they got reservations for about 10 of us in a theater, and it was quite an experience.
That's awesome. That's awesome. A good movie with the family. I actually saw it with my father and my father-in-law when they were visiting, so it was the same thing. Very nice family outing. And I know that movie. I know Mickey loved that movie too. I don't see it here on his list, but he was ranting and raving about it a few weeks ago when he saw it.
Yeah.
And speaking of Mickey Williams,
you're not going to do you're going to do mine.
I'm going to do you next. Okay. I'm going to go last, of course. But you want me to read your list, Mick?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So Mickey's list is Thin Red Line, which was on Mr. Capovilla's list, I believe. Number 2, you have Apocalypse Now. I think that's on my dad's favorite list. Number 3 is Starship Troopers.
I love that film.
I got a follow-up question on that one. Number 4 is Predator. I hope we don't have Mr. Capovilla doing his Schwarzenegger voice today, but and then your number 5 is Top Gun, but the original one, right, Mick?
Yeah, the original.
Yeah. All right, so tell us about Starship Troopers. Isn't that some kind of spoof too, or no?
No, it's based off of a novel by Robert Heinlein. He was a sci-fi writer, but I think he served the military. If you read the book, there's a lot of military stuff in it, but also the film. I just liked how it seemed to me like a 90s kind of like advertisement for the military to get these young recruits to join the military to go fight these bugs in outer space. And to me, it seemed the culture there seemed a lot like the culture in the infantry at the time. And it is kind of, I wouldn't say it's a spoof. It's not a comedy. It kind of is. But I mean, it's a wild show, man. There's some scenes in there, like one of the guys. I think his name is like Colonel Ratjack or whatever. He's played by Michael Ironsides, and he's this hardcore guy. And at one scene, he gets like eaten in half by a bug, and I think it's like Corporal Rico or whoever the main guy is. He's like, Rico, you know what to do. You know what to do. I
remember that scene.
And then he racks around and shoots him in the chest, and Mercy kills him.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, that's wild.
All right. Well, a great addition to the main list. And by the way, I think what we're going to do is we'll put this episode up on YouTube, and then we'll take comments from everybody on their favorites and where they disagree with us, and then maybe even do a follow-up show since it's kind of fun. All right, I'll give my list of top 5, and then we'll get going on the substance of today's podcast. My number 1 is The Peacemaker with George Clooney. Number 2 is No Way Out with Kevin Costner. Number 3, which is probably a little bit of a stretch for a military movie, but The Great Santini with Robert Duvall.
Right.
I love that scene where he's walking down the gym, up at the top of the gym. He's like, you put him on the floor, don't come home. Number 4 is Aliens.
Yes. Great movie.
Badass Marines in that movie. And then my number 5 is 13 Days, which is about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Somebody should put her in charge, man.
Yeah.
One of the classic lines. Yeah, game over. Put her in charge.
I love that movie. And I think at the end we might do favorite characters from movies, and my favorite is from Aliens. So, well, that was great. That was fun. And like I said, we'll put this episode up on YouTube. We'll get some feedback from our audience as to where we went wrong on that list. But thanks for putting that together, guys. I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Capovilla here, and he's going to get us started on today's substantive topic. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that was fun. So moving on to more serious topics now. We're going to be talking about the 2022 NDAA. Mickey's going to talk about where that bill currently sits, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what changes we are going to see, and then we're going to kind of turn the floor over to our special guest and do a little Q&A and soak up his wisdom. So, Mick, if you want to get going, we can start there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Very quick. So on December 15th, the Senate passed the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022, and then it was signed into law by the president on December 27th. So it's now law. Now, what does that mean? I think Rob's going to explain kind of what those changes are and the impacts that we might see. So, Rob, go ahead and tell us. That's where the law sits. What does that actually mean, though?
Yeah, it's a done deal. These changes are happening. So The main purpose there's a lot of changes that happened with the 2022 NDA. Obviously, the one that's gotten the most publicity is the creation of this novel independent office of the Special Trial Counsel that will go into effect for each service except the Coast Guard, where in the Coast Guard they will still be reporting directly to the civilian secretary of that service instead of the Judge Advocate General or Chief of Staff. The Judge Advocate General will select these special trial counsels, known as the STCs, who are obviously going to be judge advocates, and they're going to be selected based on qualifications that we're used to seeing with panel members and court martials. They're going to be selected based on their education, their training, their experience, their temperament. And this senior trial counsel will serve in the grade of 07. So they're going to be brigadier generals in the force.
Well, real quick, Rob, who selects them, though? Is that the JAG or the
I believe it's the TJAG is going to be selecting them, correct.
Interesting.
Now, there's going to be a lot of authority passed on to this STC. Notably, the STC will have exclusive authority over the covered offenses, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also related offenses, as well as any other offenses alleged to have been committed by the individual being charged, who's the accused. So, for example, the STC is going to have prosecutorial authority or discretion over soldiers accused of sexual assault, and then any other offenses, if there's a 120 offense or related offense, any other offense that he's charged with or that she's charged with, they will have discretion over those offenses too. So you're going to see folks that are charged with, say, a sex assault, and the charge sheet may also contain conduct unbecoming, and the STC will actually have discretion over those related or additional charges, I should say. Now, the acts... The NDAA covers these specific charges, right? These covered offenses. Wrongful broadcast or distribution of intimate visual images, that's Article 117 Alpha. Murder under Article 118. Manslaughter under Article 119. Rape and sex assault, including of children, and certain other types of sexual misconduct under Articles 120, 120 Bravo, 120 Charlie. Kidnapping under Article 125. This one I thought was interesting. Domestic violence under the relatively new Article 128 Bravo. Stalking under Article 130. Retaliation under Article 132. And producing, processing, receiving, viewing, and distributing child pornography under Article 134, as well as conspiring to or attempting or soliciting any of the above. And of course, those are Articles 80, 81, and 82. So the bottom line here is that traditionally speaking, what we've seen up to this point in military justice is the command retains essentially what amounts to prosecutorial discretion, and this is a fundamental and significant change where this senior trial counsel position, this judge advocate 07, is going to have discretion and prosecutorial authority over all of those allegations mentioned, all those charges mentioned, and then anything else that would be on the charge sheet if one of these charges is on the charge sheet. That is an awful lot of power being shifted from traditionally the chain of command, the GCMCA, to now the senior trial counsel. There are some other changes we're going to dive into with Dave, but that's kind of the gravamon of the rule. So Dave, let's jump into our Q&A section. Mick and I are going to rotate questions for you, and we cannot wait to hear your answers and get educated on some of these topics. So Mick, with that being said, go ahead and start off, brother.
Okay. So Dave, so we got these reforms now. And I guess the major question is why is this happening? Who's pushing it, and why do they feel that it's necessary?
That's a great question. In looking at this for the last number of years, it seems to me that there are probably three different interest groups that are pushing it. There are individuals who have always felt that military justice needed reforming, regardless of what the issue happens to be. And that number isn't necessarily large, but, kind of their goal in life is to change military justice. I suppose you could say to civilianize it. You also have a few people in Congress that were very unhappy with the military's response to sexual assault offenses. You know, they've been pushing that, and leading that is probably Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who held hearings and listened to testimony of victims over the years. And I think some of these changes dealing with sexual assaults go back all the way to 2011, 2012, 2013. And the third group seems to be those that believe that we really ought to model our military justice system after our allies, in terms of Germany, Great Britain, Israel. And that's always a little bit puzzling to me, because they often make the comparison that, well, the systems work well in those countries, why won't they work in the United States military justice system? And there are a lot of good reasons for that I don't really think we need to get into today. But one of them is just the geographical disbursement of forces,
right?
The overall culture and attitude about justice. So there may be others who are players in this, but I think that's primarily what was driving it. And they all came together. It was like I don't want to say a perfect storm, but everything came together, and they were able to get these changes through in 2022.
Let me ask you this, Dave. Let me ask you this, Dave. So we have this creation. I've been kind of jokingly referring it to as the all-powerful prosecutor, the Super JAG, yeah, right? That's what I've been calling it, the Super JAG. But it's the Special Trial Counsel. I'm interested to hear, what role do you see this 07 officer having? And I guess more importantly, what problems do you see with the creation, or potential problems, I guess, with the creation of this new position?
I think a lot's going to depend on how much authority or how much they delegate to the 07. If you think about it, they're probably going to be physically located in the Washington, D.C. area. And I've heard through the grapevine that at least in the Army, they expect that this 07 will be making most of the prosecutorial decisions. And that causes me some concern, because you would never think of that in, for example, a state court system. Here in Texas, if we're in Bexar County, San Antonio, Texas, our district attorney has a sole authority to decide what charges to bring against individuals. But if the legislature in Texas decided, well, we're going to focus that in Austin up the road, the people would be in arms, because, who knows best as to what the prosecution ought to be in a particular case. So I think one potential problem, if they put a lot of that final decision-making authority at the upper echelons, you'll end up with what I refer to as kind of an ivory tower decision. I think a better system is to use the 07 as kind of the guiding individual, and then you have your regional prosecutors and you have your local prosecutors. And the local prosecutors really ought to have a lot of say. They're the ones interviewing the witnesses. In sexual assault, for example, it's often he said, she said. So you need to have eyes on the individual. You literally need to sit across a table and look at them and determine what's going to happen if you go to trial. They have good eye contact. And if you push that decision up to Washington, D.C., you might have somebody giving a narrative about what their impression was of the victim or of the accused. I think that's going to be a potential problem. There are a couple others that I can go on. If you want to respond to that one first before I go on.
Yeah, so I think that's a fascinating take, and one that I agree with. And we know that behind the scenes, the primary push for these changes has been the military's response, or the lack thereof, specifically to sexual assault and sexual assault-related changes. I'm interested to get your take on this, because I anticipate what we're going to see is the first 3 to 5 years that this new 07's in position. I imagine we're going to see even more of an uptick in prosecutions with sexual assaults, because the military, those folks are going to want to report back to Congress and say, hey, see, look, we're doing more than we were doing before. Do you agree with that, Dave? Do you think we're going to see that to justify the new position?
I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And this ties in with one of my other concerns, and that is the possibility of unlawful command influence at the highest level. This 07 is going to be directly accountable to the Secretary of the Service. The Secretary is a political appointee. There's no longer a military chain of command. The 07 doesn't report to an 08. And so I could see instances where if, for example, the conviction rate was dropping or not enough cases were being brought to trial, that somebody in Congress would place a phone call to the Secretary of the Army, for example, and say, hey, what's going on over there? Can't you get your act together? And so I could then see the Secretary of the Army picking up the phone, calling the 07 and say, tell me what's going on. And we all know, if we've had any experience with the military, that phone call, as innocent as it might be in intent, could be viewed as unlawful command influence. We know from recent cases that it's possible for those at the flag or the general rank to be involved in unlawful command influence, even in the JAG rank. So I think you're right. I think in an attempt to respond to what Congress has said, I think a lot of cases are going to go to trial. I think you're also going to potentially see not all of those cases resulting in the guilty verdict, which in itself could get a negative response out of Congress. It's as though, and listening to some of the debate, it's as though they prosecute every case where there's been an allegation, for example, of sexual assault. And I think their members of Congress, being perhaps not familiar with due process or the rule of law, would expect that if you bother to go to trial, you're going to end up with a conviction, which will be upheld on appeal. So I think they're going to be mixed responses, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether the uptick in prosecutions results in an uptick in convictions as well.
Yeah, I guess that remains to be seen. It does seem as though that the Super JAG will essentially be operating on a mandate, so it'll be kind of like his mission to go ahead and he or she will think, well, my job is to prosecute cases. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think your predictions are probably correct. But moving on now, Dave, what about this idea about getting rid of the sentencing from jury members or panel members? Now it looks like it's just going to be judge alone. Is that right? Like the judge is going to be the one who actually sentences the accused if the trial ends up in a guilty verdict.
Yes, I have mixed feelings about that. I like the idea that when members did the sentencing, they were representing the command, and it strikes me that that's very, very important. I know that when I was at the JAG school, we brought in battalion and brigade commanders for what we call the solo course, senior officers legal orientation course. And there was a 2 or 3 hour seminar that they had to go through. It was called sentencing. And it was very interesting to conduct those seminars because you would give them a fact situation and you would say the accused has been convicted of this. And those commanders had a wide variety of views, and it reflected the idea, and this is part of the jury system in the civilian community, is that the jury's in a very good position to assess the level of criminality involved, the accused or the defendant's background, and to make those decisions. Now, there's been a push over the years to civilianize sentencing, and this last act finally took that in consideration. And the argument was that we need to model ourselves after federal systems. So in federal criminal courts, the judges do the sentencing. Now, that leads to a real question. I don't know if you're going to raise this about sentencing parameters, but I think that there's something that's being lost by not giving the accused the choice, as under the 2016 Act, as to who was going to do the sentencing.
I didn't really, when this came out, this one surprised me. Maybe in your circles, Dave, you had kind of gotten a hint that this was coming. I did not, and I was a little taken back by this. The only justification that I can see, besides trying to make us more like the civilians, is that they want to be able to get those panel members back to doing their jobs, which are important. But I agree with you. I think that takes something away from the process. We've always had the option of going with panel or judge, and that's a decision that we help our clients make based on kind of the tone, the tenor of how trial goes, the findings made by the panel. But moving, talking specifically about these parameters, we don't know what they're going to be. We know they're going to be at least modeled after the federal code. And here, and I kind of want your thoughts on this, Dave, because here are my concerns. In all aspects of military justice, at least what we've seen in recent cases like the Dial decision that argues there should not be a unanimous verdict because we're so very different. The military system is so very, very different than the civilian system. But yet this seems to directly contradict that. And if there's ever a place where we need to be different, I feel like it's in sentencing, because we represent people, I mean, Mickey's a prior Army Ranger himself. We represented Army Rangers. We've represented Navy SEALs. We've represented folks that have done incredible things overseas in combat. And I feel like these parameters are not going to properly take that into account. I mean, that's how we are different. It does give leeway to the military judges, right? They can basically put forward specific findings of fact and justify the reasoning why they vary from those parameters. But that's really my concern here. What are your thoughts about that? Am I talking craziness, or do you think I'm on with that?
No, you're spot on. I have some concerns about the sentencing parameters. First of all, it's a very complex system. And as I've said at various presentations to audiences, I think there's a danger that an attempt to reform military justice and model it after the civilian codes, we may have the unintended consequence of making things more complicated than they really need to be. And I think that may be a prime example of a potential problem in the sentencing parameters. If you do internet research on sentencing guidelines under the federal system, just type in problems with federal sentencing guidelines, you'll see that there's been a tremendous amount of scholarship on the problems with federal sentencing guidelines, that they were intended to provide some uniformity across the board. If anybody's familiar with federal sentencing guidelines, they've got a pretty complicated chart. You read down the left side, you read across the top,
right,
and then you put your finger together and you try to figure out what it's going to be. But in reality, what's been happening is that there are departures downward and upward, and there are a very high number of cases that are appealed on sentencing, and I think that's going to happen in the military. Despite the best efforts of the drafters of these parameters, there are going to be judges out there who are going to look at the numbers and say, those numbers don't fit the facts of this case. They'll put something on the record or in their judgment that explain why they departed downward or upward. And then the defense counsel will appeal the sentence to the courts of criminal appeals, which they have the right to do. And I think that it's going to create a lot of unnecessary complexity. A co-author and I have looked at this. We gave a presentation in Washington to the CAF conference this spring, and she covered the sentencing parameters. And when you break it down and take a look at how they're going to be developed, there are going to be just 5 voting members as the chief judges of the services. There's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure on them. And if you take a look at the Sentencing Guidelines Commission, the body that's responsible for reviewing the federal sentencing guidelines, it's not unusual for them to make frequent changes based on feedback they're getting from the field. And so that just creates an unnecessary level of complexity, because if you're practicing in the field, whether you're a special trial counsel or not, and you're trying to make an argument to the trial judge, and the trial judge says, wait a minute, I just saw an email coming out of headquarters that they've changed the sentencing parameters for this particular offense, so everybody go back to your room and come up with a new argument. The final point here is that in their federal sentencing, probation officers carry the lead do research on interviewing everybody, and they come up with a report that they present to the federal judge who'll be doing the sentencing, and then the parties are given an opportunity to respond to those recommendations, and it's out of that you actually go to the sentencing hearing, and the judge then announces what the sentence is going to be based on that probation officer. So right now, there's no such person in the military. It's going to fall on the shoulders of the trial judge. And
in the
military, things move very quickly. So I think that's a problem that I see.
Mickey, you just handled a sentencing case in federal court with a veteran. What are your thoughts? Did you agree with Dave? Because I had overlooked the fact that when I was a SALSA, they have sentencing reports. They have folks who work this on a daily basis to provide the judge an accurate picture of everything. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I agree. Typically what happens is probation gets involved and they do an investigation that takes about a month. And then at the conclusion, they submit a report to the judge. The judge takes a look at it. And then you also have the hearing that follows that, just as Dave has described. That ended up in it. We didn't actually end up doing that in that case. We ended up getting a really good deal, which was kind of my question about this is, will that impact, will these sentencing parameters, and if people don't know what we mean by sentencing parameters, we're talking about like mandatory minimums and kind of guidelines, what the judge is going to be looking at in order to determine an appropriate sentence for the accused who's just been convicted. Is that going to impact deals? Like, are we going to be bound to these parameters, do you think, or has that even been a discussion? I guess my concern is it's going to be really tough to get a deal in a case if the mandatory minimum or the sentencing parameters is like minimum 5 years, 5 to 10, 5 to 15 years. Well, you might as well go to trial because you might win the case, right? So what do you think, Dave, about these sentencing parameters impacting guilty plea deals or anything like that?
That's a good point. That's not a point that I've given a lot of thought to, but I think you're right on. I think there's also going to be a temptation as we kind of work through this, and I think for most of these changes, they don't go into effect until December 27th, 2023. So there are folks in the Pentagon who are scrambling to put all this together, so we probably won't see any real changes playing out in the real world until probably the spring of 2024. But I do think it's going to have an impact, and I think there's going to be a potential danger. You know, the federal judges and military judges are barred from taking part in any kind of plea bargaining. But I could see the discussions going on behind the scenes between a criminal defense lawyer and a special trial counsel, for example, in one of the covered offenses. They're both looking at these parameters and scratching their heads and say, we have no idea where the judge is going to come out on this. They might have a gut feeling, and so both sides are trying to negotiate what they consider to be a fair agreement without really knowing what the judge thinks. And I think there may be a danger for the judge to give a wink, wink, and a nod and say, well, if I were to sentence, I'd probably fall in this range. Or the judge might make a rather innocuous statement about, well, I intend to follow the parameters to the T. You know, if the range is this and this, I'm not going to depart because I think the intent was to fall within the range. Or you might have a military judge who says, I don't like the parameters. This is all over happy hour cocktails, right?
Right.
I'm not really happy with the parameters, so I'm going to do the right thing. Well, the right thing might be a departure upward or downward. So there's going to be a break-in period, but I think that's an excellent point. I think it is going to have an adverse impact to some extent. And I think you mentioned it in your earlier comments that the exclusive authority for doing pretrial agreements or plea bargaining, we used to call them pretrial agreements, plea bargaining, is going to fall exclusively with the special trial counsel.
Right. And I'm going to tell you guys what I'm terrified about. And I know it's coming. I know this is going to happen. The minimum mandatory sentence for sex assault is going to be something north of 8 years, regardless of the surrounding circumstances. I'm almost certain that's going to come down. And the reality is a lot of the clients we represent are college-age folks who mom and dad are helping them pay the bill, who join the Army or the military to better their lives because they don't come from a whole lot. They go out, they have some drinks with some friends or drinks with a girl, and one thing leads to another. And they're found guilty, and maybe rightfully so, and maybe not. And a lot of times what we're seeing is the judges taking in consideration things like this. What truly was the intent? What role did alcohol take to play here? How egregious is this? And by and large, we're seeing a lot of sentences between 6 months and about 3 to 4 years, which I think are just. I mean, there is a difference between that kind of scenario compared to formulating an intent to sexually assault somebody or rape somebody. And I'm just afraid that what we're going to see is, mandatory minimums that send these young folks away for 8, 10, 12 years, regardless of the surrounding circumstances. That is my biggest fear with all of this.
Well, I think what that could do, and Dave, before you jump in, I think what that might do is allow for negotiations for a lesser charge. That could be something, right? So instead of having them plead guilty to a 120, maybe there's room to negotiate for a 128 because they know the sentencing parameters are so, off kilter with that particular factual scenario. But if it goes to trial and you get all the way to verdict and found guilty, that's rough. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's going to be.
I think you're going to see a lot of these cases appealed if I were a criminal defense lawyer and if I thought that the sentence did not really fit the crime or the accused or even the victim. I'm going to appeal it. And then you end up with senior judge advocates at the Court of Criminal Appeals level looking at these factors And if you take a look at the statute and what this committee is supposed to come up with, they have the ranges. They've got these, what I call the ranges, or they've got these categories. But then they also are supposed to come up with specific criteria. And that list could be 12 or 15 different factors, which ends up giving a lot of discretion to the military judges.
I see. Yeah.
To either depart upward or downward. And I think that that's going to be right then for a sentence appeal.
Right.
The argument is that under the facts of the case, the arguments that were made, what the conviction was for, the background of the accused and the victim, that the sentence is disproportionate to what it should have been. And we're already, even in the current system, that a lot of cases are appealed on sentencing issues where the Court of Criminal Appeals gets involved in going back and trying to reinvent the wheel as to what an appropriate sentence ought to be. So we see a lot of cases going back to the field for sentencing rehearings. And I think that that's going to simply escalate under the new system.
I think that's a wonderful point that I had not thought of, and I think you're 100% right. I think you're spot on with that. So, Dave, we're going to cover two more points with you. We're going to talk about the new Article 134 for sexual harassment, and then I'd love to kind of get your feel on unanimous verdicts. So we know that there is going to be a new Article 134 for sexual harassment, and we know that was signed into law. When you heard that and when you saw this was coming down, what were your thoughts about that, especially under the circumstances that folks can be prosecuted under Article 92 and 93 right now for sexual harassment? What were kind of your initial thoughts and feelings about that?
My initial thought was why? Why right. Did they feel it was important to identify this? And it was a really weird, rather than establishing under a new punitive article, which Congress could have done, they directed that the president put it under 134 in the manual for courts martial and then listed the elements of the offense. So when you take a look at the elements of the offense, there's a tremendous amount of wiggle room.
Right.
Because it's under 134, you've got these final elements that need to be proved, prejudice, good order, and discipline, et cetera. But you see the word reasonable throughout. A reasonable person. And any lawyer knows that that's kind of wiggle room. I was the reporter for the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure Advisory Committee for 17 years. And I listened to a lot of debates on what ought to go into a rule of criminal procedure. So you had the defense counsel being represented, you had the Justice Department, you had judges, then you had a few academics. The judges were most concerned about having their hands tied. And I can tell you that in more one case, I or somebody else would suggest inserting the word reasonable, and everybody took a sigh of relief and said, hey, we're great with that. Because the word reasonable gives a lot of leeway to the actors in the courtroom as to what the argument should be. Right. So when I read these elements, I see the word reasonable, I say there's a lot of wiggle room there. So I don't know that it was really necessary. I think there was a lot of pressure to politically pressure to just come up with an offense. So it's there. It's effective, I guess, immediately. It's been placed into the manual for courts martial, I guess, this last spring. So I don't know if any cases are actually being prosecuted under it or not.
Well, does that impact Article 93, the cruelty maltreatment stuff? Can you still proceed under that theory?
Sure. We just had a trial on it, this week, right? Sean and Dan were out at Fort Bragg defending cruelty maltreatment. I do think there's going to be some issues potentially with preemption, depending on how the charge is drawn up. I do think that's an issue, and I think that's something we're going to have to take a close look at.
They could, theoretically, 92 could be under 600-20 if we're talking about the Army.
Right.
Article 93, and now this 134.
Right.
Now there might be multiplicity issues, but they could, theoretically, they could probably charge all that.
My feeling is, if you're going to charge sexual harassment, I don't think Article 134, the new charge, makes it any easier. I've never understood, to me, charge it under Article 92. If you're going to charge it and you think it's there, charge it under Article 92, because it's very clear, at least from my perspective, what sexual harassment is defined at in the regs. I think Article 134, this new article, actually makes it a little more difficult for the prosecutors to get a conviction, which kind of made me laugh because President Biden signed this into law thinking that this was some kind of sweeping change. And even when we were interviewed, so just some background, Dave, we were interviewed by some news outlets, including CNN, about this. And my comments were, I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it makes it any easier to get a conviction on sexual harassment. I
Yeah,
don't know
you're
what your
right.
thoughts on that, Dave, but to me, it almost complicates matters.
Yeah, I think it probably does. That goes back to my original concern about if Congress isn't careful, they're going to make a real mess of this. You know, they're well intended, I have no doubt.
Right.
And I guess what I ought to do is interject this. When I've talked to audiences about these changes, I really try to be as positive as I can. It's really easy for me, as somebody who's been around military justice for 5 decades, to sound like a grumpy old man. And I know that I remember when I was on active duty and we had that were going through Congress, you talk to some of these old jags and they would just sit around drinking their coffee and grumbling about how the world was going to hell in a handpot. And so I've really tried hard to remain positive. And I really do believe that with all of the challenges that we've identified in this podcast, that there are folks in the Pentagon who are bright and energetic and they're going to figure all this out and are going to try to avoid the unintended consequences. I really do believe that. I think there are going to be some challenges. I think there are going to be some problems down the road. This is one example where I don't believe it was really necessary. What's going to happen is you're going to probably have some overcharging taking place, as I'm quickly looking down the list of covered offenses. So the military type offenses of 90, 92, AWOL, desertion, those are not covered offenses.
Right.
They fall under the traditional trial counsel. And we haven't used the word, but this is going to create a bifurcated system. So you've got a local prosecutor who is not beholden to the 07 in Washington making these decisions. And I've seen enough of these cases that are on other areas where they're probably going to charge under 92. Maybe there was an order given to cease and desist. So you'll have 90, 92, 93, 134, and they'll go to trial. The defense counsel will make a motion to dismiss, either for multiplicity, overcharging, or for preemption. And then the judge and the prosecutor and the defense counsel are going to hash out what charges actually go to trial.
Right.
Because I think that from a trial counsel standpoint, I don't want to lose a case before it even gets started. You know, I don't want the judge throwing out the 134 charge for some problem with the specification and then being dead in the water and not have anything else to go to trial on. So it's not unusual to see that. You know, where you charge the 134 offense and then some other substantive offense along with it. Right.
No, I think that's a great point. All right, Dave, we're running a little short on time, but we want to talk about unanimous verdicts, and we'll make this one pretty succinct. You know where the appeals courts have come down now, the most recent being U.S. v. Dial, Judge Brookhart coming out and saying no unanimous verdicts. 5 years from today, Dave, what is your opinion? Do we have unanimous verdicts or not?
I think we will. I think that in Congress, people will argue that, you know, we need to be like the federal or the state systems. And I think that's probably coming. I think it's going to make it easier for defense counsel in the future to get acquittals. I've heard the arguments. I've made the arguments. You know, the military is unique. I think it's less unique now than it was 40 or 50 years ago. But yeah, I see unanimous verdicts coming down the pike.
I agree. I know Mickey does. Yeah. They're going to have a hard time justifying how different we are, considering every step they're taking right now is to make us more like the civilian system. That being said, I see Matt getting very antsy over here. I know we'd like to finish up with a fun topic, Dave. So, Matt, before you jump out of your chair, go ahead and let's have a laugh or two and finish up on a lighthearted note.
I do get antsy. I do get it. But let me just say that was a phenomenal discussion. Dave, thank you very much. Mickey and Rob said you would be great on the podcast, and you delivered. You always know when somebody knows a topic well. There's no wasted word in their analysis. There's no ums. There's no pauses. You clearly know this stuff exceptionally well. You can see both sides of it. You can absorb all this information and dissect it. And I think it's going to be our best podcast episode up to this point. So thank you again very much for taking the time to talk with us today. We're going to close the show. We talked at the beginning of the show about favorite military movies. Now we're going to give our favorite characters from a military movie. It doesn't have to be from the one that appeared on your earlier list. And you can give up to 3, but you only have to give 1. And I'm going to start with Mickey this time, since I think we put him on the back burner last time. So, Mickey, your top 1 or 3 military movie characters of all times.
Sure. I'm happy to do it. And I agree with everything Matt said, Dave. Thank you very much for coming on. All right. My first one is Robert Duvall as Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now. I thought that guy, as crazy as that film was, he made it even crazier and not actually that unrealistic, I'm sure, for battalion commanders in those days. My second one was Master Chief John James Urgile from G.I. Jane, believe it or not. Viggo Mortensen played him.
Love
That's
him.
right.
Yeah.
He was great in that.
Yeah.
He was great in that. That's a great pick,
Yeah.
Nick.
And then my last one is Blaine, played by Jesse Ventura in Predator. And he gets his heart blown out by the Predator in that.
Sewn in there like an Alabama tick.
That's right.
That's right. Those are my top three.
Awesome. Though those are three good ones. Robert Capovilla, how about you?
So I kind of gave this away earlier. Jeff Daniels playing Colonel Chamberlain in Gettysburg, I thought was a phenomenal role for him. And like I said, when he gives the order to fix bayonets, and maybe the most important the most important order ever given by a commander in the field during a battle, because if the flank falls at Gettysburg, that may be a certain rewriting of history. And I still get chills when I see that role, or when I hear him talk about that. Tom Hanks from A League of Their Own. You could argue that's not a war movie, but it takes place during World War II, and it's got a lot of impacts. And,
There's no crying in baseball.
and he should have gotten an Academy Award for that.
Lord.
When he argues with the umpire in that movie, that is one of the best scenes that he's ever done. And then third, I've got Sean Penn's character from A Thin Red Line.
Yeah. First arm.
I never served in an infantry unit like Mickey, but growing up after watching that, to me, he epitomized what an infantry soldier in combat would be like.
Excellent. Phenomenal list. Dave Schlueter, your list of top military movie characters of all time, sir.
All right, Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
A friend told me that, and if you look at a couple of the scenes, he swears that a copy of one of my books is on the judge's bench. I've never
Wow.
confirmed that. And
Is that Colonel
yeah,
Jessup?
so
Is
they
that-
talked to some.
Well, one
They
of
give
our
me a couple
listeners will verify that for sure. We get
Yes.
we get emails on those kinds of things all the time. So.
Wait, Dave, do you know which book?
No, I don't, because I've looked. I've paused it, and it's kind of fuzzy. But it looks like the coloring of one of the earlier editions. But I haven't gone back to match it. Besides, I don't want to get a big head, and if somebody included it, that's great. Secondly, John Connery in Hunt for Red October.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen that movie 4 or 5 times, and I just love it. And then finally, Goldie Hawn in Private Benjamin, where she says to her NCO, where are the condos, where are the sailing boats? Because she obviously signed up thinking the military was going to do one thing, it turned into something else. So those are my top three.
That's a great selection there. I had not thought about Goldie Hawn. I've seen that movie once. That's an excellent selection.
I thought that movie would make somebody's list, but it did not. So here are my three. My first is Vasquez from Aliens. She's the female Marine.
Yes.
Let's rock and roll.
That's right. Let's rock. They say no live ammo, and she's like stuffing it in all her gear. But my second is, and I'm sure I'll mispronounce his last name because I don't know, but Eric Bana in Black Hawk Down.
Yeah.
He was very good. That character, I think the real guy ended up getting court-martialed or ended up getting in some very, very serious trouble. But Bana
was he a
great.
ranger in that movie?
No, he was a Delta Force guy.
Yeah. But that was sweet. And then my third, and I can't believe this didn't make anybody else's, but Hartman from Full Metal Jacket, right? The drill instructor, the drill sergeant.
That's right.
I think that was
Ermey.
I just thought that was a little predictable. I thought sorry, Matt.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm the civilian guy here, so of course I thought that was great. You guys probably were unimpressed.
Bill Paxton character.
I got an idea for you, gentlemen. You've got a lot of interest on this. Why don't you do an entire podcast on the role of movies in framing the public's perception of military, even
Great
perhaps
idea.
military justice?
That's
Just pick the cases dealing with military justice, Cane Mutiny, Few Good Men, all that good stuff.
That is a great idea, and Matt is very happy to hear that because he's been pushing something like that on us a while, and now that the man has spoken, I think we have to do
lighthearted
Christmas episode.
Well, this one went a little bit long, but it was a phenomenal episode. We thank you again, Dave, for all of your time and wisdom that you put into this. I'd love to have you back. I know Mickey and Rob would love to have you back at some point in the future as well. So hopefully we can arrange that.
Before we end, Dave.
It was an honor to be with you all today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
No, thank you for coming on, and this is gonna sound cheesy, but I'd love to have a signed copy. I have all your books. I'd love to have a signed copy of it. If I mail it to you, you think you mail it back?
I will sign it.
All right, outstanding. Thank you.
You just made Mickey's day. and one last thing before we close out. One last thing. I never do this, but I promised a co-counsel of mine in the military who did a phenomenal job on a pretty high-profile case I have that I would give him a shout-out with Dave on the line. So I want to shout out to Nick Aliota, bright guy, Emory law grad, U.S. Air Force judge advocate, has a tremendous future ahead of him. Nick, thank you so much for your hard work.
There you go. There you go.
Good job, Nick.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. So signing off from the Military Justice Today podcast, another great episode. We will see you all next time. Thank you. Be safe.
Thanks for listening to the Military Justice Today podcast with your hosts, Robert Capovilla and Mickey Williams. This show was made possible in part by the law firm of Capovilla and Williams. For more information or to listen to more episodes, visit militaryjusticetoday.com.